There we go. Got it. Okay. So welcome everybody. Our guest today is Hannah Evans. And I'm going to read all of the introduction because I find some of this very interesting. She works as a senior analyst at Population Connection, where she focuses on public speaking and the development of open source academic style resources. She also cultivates partnerships between Population Connection and international NGOs. Before joining Population Connection staff, Hannah worked as an adjunct professor of women's studies and taught classes on gender, science, and feminist theory. She has nonprofit experience working as a program developer for sustainable agriculture and public health programs in Honduras and Panama, and has worked as a researcher studying food security issues throughout Southern California. Impressed yet? Just hold your phone. Hannah holds a BA in environmental policy and natural resource conservation and political science, and a master's in political ecology from San Diego State University, where her research focused on sustainability labeling and ethical consumption between the United States and Nicaragua. And then just more generally, she is interested in working with students, professors, and activists to promote positive social and environmental change. So yay, she's here with some movers and shakers. Her work investigates the ways population dynamics intersect with global, social, political, economic, and environmental systems, and advocates for integrated developmental solutions that simultaneously combat climate change and social injustices. So you know we're all about that. Through an examination of some of the root causes of high fertility, her work seeks to highlight the interconnections between poverty, resource use and consumption, population pressures, women's rights, and environmental challenges made worse by climate change. So these are like all of my hot button issues. I'm super excited that she's here with us. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Hannah. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sarah. Just to be clear, can you all see my PowerPoint? And it's in the right version. It's not in presenter mode or anything.
Right. We see the main screen.
I think it might be in presenter mode because we can see the thumbnails down below of the upcoming slides.
Okay. Let's see here.
Give me just a second.
Maybe I'll take this. Is that better?
Yep, perfect. Looks great.
Awesome. All right. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Hannah Evans, and I work as the senior analyst at an organization called Population Connection. And Population Connection is a US-based nonprofit organization that advocates for increased US funding for family planning programs internationally. We also do a lot of education and outreach surrounding some of the major concepts and themes behind global population growth and demographic trends, access to resources and other social justice issues, and the environment, in particular climate change. So a lot of the research that I do within this organization focuses on the connections between population and climate change. And ultimately, I look at the intersections between gender equality and climate adaptation. So today we're going to be covering a lot of information, looking at just kind of the broad scope of things as it relates to global demographic trends, the environment, climate change, and so forth. And ultimately, I'm going to be arguing that increases in access to healthcare and education, especially for women and girls, needs to be more broadly understood and considered as one very important solution to an adaptation strategy for climate change. And this is an introductory slide that I like to use just to kind of showcase our theoretical basis in terms of our work. So we use what's called a PHE, or a population health and environment approach to developmental solutions. So that means that we really strive to educate about the very interconnected nature of development and of our issues globally, recognizing that they are very interconnected and interdependent. So, for example, if we're an environmental organization, which we are, interested in understanding the ways in which humans impact the environment, it's not enough for us to just look at deforestation and habitat destruction and the various forms of environmental harm that are being put forth and perpetuated by human beings. in order for us to really understand and address this issue, we need to be looking at the reasons behind people interacting with their environment in certain ways, which in an international and globalized context has a lot to do with poverty, marginalization, socioeconomic status, access to resources, governmental structure, and so on, right? So this approach allows us to incorporate social elements into environmental problems to more broadly understand and work to confront many of our world's issues. Most kind of commonly, it's used as a modality to infuse healthcare into developmental strategies that simultaneously work to address social and environmental problems. And we'll get into, what this means throughout the presentation, but ultimately, this is a theory that looks at the health of humanity as being very much dependent on the health of the planet, which of course is true and something that we need to be kind of harnessing as we move forward here. So for example, one organization we partner with, Sarah at the beginning mentioned that we partner with many different organizations around the world that work in some way on our mission, which is quite broad. And one such organization is Path Foundation Philippines, or PFPI. And they use a really successful, really interesting integrative PHE approach in their developmental work. So they work to simultaneously increase access to voluntary family planning services, which allows social structures to change in ways that allow people to gain more reproductive autonomy and to ostensibly slow population growth through this increase in access to the resource. They do this with climate smart development strategies. So in the case of the Philippines, this has a lot to do with like sustainable fisheries management systems. And they infuse all of this as well with tools for women's empowerment. So women are actually trained as leaders within their communities and stewards of their lands regarding environmental sustainability and protection. So this is an opportunity that allows for not only, environmental protections and ecological balance to become more prolific, but also changes social structures in ways that kind of refutes otherwise very patriarchal norms that disallow women from assuming any type of leadership position within communities. This is a slide with pictures taken from one of PFPI's mangrove restoration programs. And this is a program that's entirely women run and led. So again, women train other women as stewards of the lands, as protectors of the ecosystems, which in the case of the Philippines, really does have a lot to do with mangrove restoration. Mangroves are very important for marine and tropical ecosystems such as this. They act as really important marine life homes and protections, but also they protect against big storms, which are increasing in frequency and intensity because of climate change. So they've been largely destroyed because they've been used as a commodity for export internally and internationally. So this program seeks to restore some of the devastation that has been caused. And again, they're doing this in ways that simultaneously tackles both social inequities and environmental problems. And all of this is to get us to start thinking about climate change as being much more than just an environmental issue. It's also a very deeply rooted into the social injustices under which we're all living, right? So for example, in the case of women and girls, even though we understand that, of course, climate change is affecting everyone and changing everything, because women and girls are collectively poorer, they're more directly dependent on natural resources, climate-sensitive natural resources for sustenance and survival, because of patriarchal norms, which again disallow women from, assuming leadership positions or making decisions, and create situations where they have less access to mobility, education, healthcare, and other vital resources. Women are, on average, more vulnerable to climate change in comparison to their male counterparts just because of these unequal systems. If we understand climate change as being also a social issue, then that opens up pathways for us to be considering solutions that might ordinarily be thought of as social in nature, but that have a direct impact on the environment. For example, education. Worldwide, over 130 million girls are denied the basic human right to attend school. This is obviously an atrocity, just in and of itself. But from a more social and economic perspective, this yields a lot of harm to society at this level, right? It reduces access to better health outcomes. It reduces financial stability, individual freedom, and the ability to adapt to climate change. All of these things are increased in contrast whenever education is present and more equally distributed. Also, as we'll get into, education is very fundamental for slowing population growth through rights-based platforms that, again, allow people to gain access to more opportunity in life. Whenever women are educated, they tend statistically to have fewer, healthier children because they often choose to marry later, to go to school for longer, to obtain employment at higher levels and for longer periods of time, so on and so forth. Another example is gender equity, and this manifests in many different ways. One example is through agriculture. So in low-income regions alone, women produce 60 to 80% of food. But because they have less access to resources like land rights, credits, capital, technology, and training in comparison to men, they end up producing less food on the same amount of land. Research from Project Drawdown, which is a really great organization I'll be quoting many times throughout this presentation, estimates that if these gender gaps were closed, just if everybody got access to the same resources, farm yields could rise by up to 30%. This is a huge, huge deal, a really big statistic, and something that we need to be paying attention to, right? In the wake of, trying to figure out how to produce more food to feed growing populations into the future without further contributing to climate change. The ability to produce more food on less land also ostensibly reduces the demand for deforestation, which comes as a consequence of needing to, clear more land to produce more food. Many of you might be familiar with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. They're put in place by the United Nations every 10 or 15 or so years, and they involve a series of goals, social, economic, and environmental goals that aim to create a better planet, right? Some of these goals include the elimination of poverty, for example, better health and well-being, as you can see, gender equality, climate action. And the point of this presentation is to really highlight and get us to and just clarify the ways in which all of these solutions are very interdependent, right? So really achieving better marine conservation, better environmental sustainability on land, and climate action is predicated on the expansion of good health and well-being, of gender equality, of achieving universal education. Without addressing the social injustices, we will be unable to address the environmental problems and vice versa, right? Because everything is so interconnected. And I'll get into the basis for this, but this is kind of what I want us to think about throughout this presentation, is again to recognize that if we're interested in achieving climate action in an international and global scope, this very necessarily also means achieving gender equality, bettering health and well-being, infusing integrated development strategies that simultaneously address social, economic, and environmental issues within societies. This also very necessarily includes quality education and meeting unmet needs for sexual and reproductive health throughout the world. So in terms of climate change, I think we're probably all well aware, of the state of things at this point, because every single day we're bombarded with new news articles telling us about the impending dangers that we're all going to need to face and are already facing. But just to give some context here, the world is heating up. There are many places on the planet that are experiencing warmer than average temperatures, and many places as well that are actually breaking records for heat. The IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the world's most well-renowned, but also, I think, conservative assessment of climate change, has come out finally within the past couple of years and stated that unequivocally human influence is contributing to the temperature increases that we're seeing play out and cause climate change. So this, arguably was never a scientifically contentious issue, but now we can all, form a broad consensus about the fact that human beings are contributing to and are causing these temperature increases that are creating all of these imbalances and environmental changes. And the IPCC, other international organizations like the UN are constantly warning us, right? Unless we enact measures to cut emissions on a global scale and on a drastic level, we're just going to continue to see temperatures increase. This is going to also increase climate impacts. This is going to put more people at risk, create uninhabitable planetary systems. This is a really big deal and something that we need to be approaching with urgency. But importantly, for this presentation and just more broadly, I hope we can all understand as well that we still have time to make a really big impact to change the course and trajectory of climate change in ways that will allow us to alter the future, be better equipped to recover and respond from climate impacts, save millions, if not billions of lives, and create better systems that will produce a more habitable planet. Again, we just need to be approaching this issue with the urgency it deserves and using every modality that we have available. And ultimately, what does that mean? Whenever we're talking about climate change on a global scale, that's a really complex undertaking, and it's a really difficult thing to even talk about at the scale because there are many different interconnected challenges facing the world today, much of which are of our own creation, right? So I want us to be thinking about population growth as one of many different interconnected challenges that we're all facing, rather than looking at it sort of hierarchically, recognizing that one contributing factor is more, severe than another. Instead, I would like us to start thinking about things as resembling more of a web, an interconnected web, where things are interacting with one another and bouncing off of one another in this type of a format that allows us to understand that the broader system under which we are operating is really mostly to blame, right? I think if we're looking at underlying drivers behind the climate crisis, one thing that we can note right away is that all of this really began and was perpetuated at such a fast level through the Industrial Revolution, which yielded really massive benefits to society from a social and economic perspective, absolutely. But in terms of the environment, has put a lot of pressure in a really short period of time on our systems, right? Because it shifted our production practices towards fossil fuels, towards a reliance on fossil fuels. It set the basis for large-scale economies of scale types of production and consumption of fossil fuels, which cause climate change, of commodities, which are fueling climate change and causing deforestation. Commodities like meat, for example, which when produced on an industrial scale causes large-scale environmental and health problems all around the world. All really daunting issues, again, if we're looking at things from such a bird's eye perspective. But again, the point of this presentation is to actually infuse hope, right? We need to be looking at these systems as being malleable, because ultimately we created them as humans. We made up all of these systems and these processes and these incentives which are driving our world economy, and it hasn't really been in place for very long, right? We have the power as well to change things, to fix things, and to create better more equitable and sustainable systems now and into the future. And so in terms of the relationship between population and the environment, I think many are well known. Worldwide, we're affecting the planet, of course, in many different ways. We're destroying wildlife habitats, causing species to go extinct. We're changing the chemistry of the oceans. We're using resources unsustainably. And as we're all well aware, we're contributing to climate change. And historically, many environmentalists have been really concerned with the continued growth of the human population for a variety of reasons, but largely because we understand that population growth usually correlates pretty linearly to some level of environmental degradation or natural resource exploitation or use. And worldwide, we can see that historically speaking, this has been very true, right? There's a direct relationship between the continued growth of the human population and a variety of indicators of ecological decline or natural resource overuse. I've put 5 different indicators up here, but there are many more that I could include. And the point here is to say, yes, there is a direct relationship, again, between population growth and resource use and environmental degradation. This is a complicated conversation, and we'll get into the nuance throughout the presentation, but this is something that we need to be comfortable looking at, acknowledging, accepting, and understanding as a way for us to properly assess what we're dealing with and then move forward, right? Create solutions that make sense. The Global Footprint Network, which is an organization that does research assessing the Earth's capacity to regenerate its resources versus human demand, now estimates that humanity demands 60% more of our planet than its ecosystems can renew. But in order to maintain 85% of the world's biodiversity, which is very necessary in maintaining a sustainable planet, human demand really should only be using half of what the planet can provide. So this means that current demand exceeds that goal by at least a factor of 3. And there are many different reasons for this. I feel like we could take an entire hour just talking about this slide. We need to be talking about corporate influence, international corporations that are fueling and perpetuating the climate crisis through, our continued reliance on fossil fuels. We need to talk about resource use and how it differs across the supply chain according to level of development, consumption levels, the uneven distribution of resources. All of it's very relevant, to be clear. But for the purposes of this presentation, also one of the most important factors behind this growing imbalance is the continued growth of the human population. So we need to be figuring out ways to talk about this openly. In my work, this is still a very contentious issue and something that needs to be approached sensitively, of course, but needs to be more broadly kind of understood and acknowledged and accepted, right? Because that's what's necessary for us to kind of solve the problem is to first acknowledge all of the different players involved. And so in terms of the global population, why is this an issue of import? Well, if we look historically, we can see just by taking one very small cursory look at this graph that things have become totally out of balance in a really short period of time, right? We can look and see that for most of human history, for the vast majority of time that people have been on this planet, population growth has not been very significant at all. This is because of really high death rates. So infant and maternal mortality was very high. Life expectancy was very low. People were living in more nomadic structures where there was a lot of precarity in terms of where food was going to come from, what the environment was going to look like, so on and so forth. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, which again happened about 250, 300 years ago, that death rates really began to fall so significantly. And again, the Industrial Revolution was a period of time that completely transformed all of our systems, right? And from a social perspective, it allowed for the invention and expansion of public health, of sanitation, of medication, of vaccines, of better technology that allowed for food production at higher and more efficient levels, of systems that created affluence or increased affluence that allowed for people to participate in the economy at higher levels, to transcend poverty, to live better lives, honestly. So this is a really amazing period of time for human beings. But in terms of the population, it caused it to totally explode. And at many times it was exponential, right? So even though growth rates are falling, growth rates are depicted here in the purple line, and they've been falling steadily, as you can see, since about 1950. Because we have such a big base of population on the planet right now, and because a lot of our population remains young, we will continue to see population growth into the future, no matter what. The extent to which our population is going to grow and the point at which it's going to stabilize is not entirely known, because it's going to depend largely on whether or not people gain access to resources and can, control their fertility, level of development, and so on throughout societies. This is a projection done by the UN, which uses historical data to form projections about the future. So they do this with like a fair amount of accuracy, but I think it's really subject to change, especially considering climate change and all of these other kind of unforeseen issues that we're now kind of having to contend with. But right now we're adding 1 billion people to the planet every 12 years. So up until 1800, it took all of human history to reach 1 billion people. Now we're adding 1 billion people to the planet every 12 years. This is unprecedented in terms of growth and really portends a lot of challenges for us as into the future, especially again, given the imminent threats posed by climate change and posed by, the availability or not of natural resources. I think it's really hard for us to kind of conceptualize how big of a number 1 billion is, not to mention 8 billion. All of us are like used to now being told that we're like trillions of dollars in debt and there's like hundreds of trillions of dollars floating around everywhere, like all of these massive numbers that we couldn't possibly understand or conceptualize. But just to give a little bit of context, if you were to count 0 to 1 billion every second, 1, 2, 3, from 0 to 1 billion, it would take almost, I think, 32 or 33 years, right? We've got 8 billion people on the planet, and we're probably going to reach somewhere around 11 billion by the end of the century. So that's just to kind of hopefully provide a little context into what we're dealing with here in terms of our population. So in terms of, again, the relationship between population and the environment, at this global scale, one thing that's very important to understand right off the bat is that there's a direct relationship between population growth rate and level of development within countries. In that the least developed countries, the poorest places, most marginalized regions, are the fastest growing. So they have the fastest population growth rates, the highest fertility rates, and they are the fastest growing in terms of population. But they have the lowest amount of environmental outputs. So they're contributing the least amount of environmental harm at the per capita or country level. In contrast, the more developed regions, places like the United States, for example, most of Western Europe, Canada, Australia, these places are growing very slowly in terms of population. They have what are called stabilized populations. And in many cases, actually, a lot of industrialized countries are starting to experience population decline, but they are producing a lot of environmental outputs. So they're contributing a lot to environmental harm, at the per capita and country level. So as you can see, and as we were just kind of talking about, the places that have the highest fertility rates are the amount of children a woman has throughout her childbearing years. These places are among the most marginalized on the planet, right? So most of Africa, in particular sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of Asia, in particular South Asia, parts of Latin America. So this means, again, here we need to make a very important distinction, which is that population growth alone is not the sole or number one contributor to any type of large-scale environmental damage. If that were true, that logic would somehow indicate that the poorest people on the planet, oftentimes people making less than $2 a day, or between like $2 and $10 a day, in the more middle income spheres, are contributing the most amount of environmental harm. This is not a true or accurate statement, but it's an oversimplification that's kind of been used in population discussions before, and it just needs to be avoided altogether. But, understanding demographic trends and population change are very important for us from pretty much all, aspects of society. And in particular, kind of as we learn what we're going to need to do in order to adapt to climate change into the future. So this is a chart depicting that information, looking at where populations are going to grow most significantly into 2100. And another thing that we need to really understand as it corresponds to the environment is level of development, and level of industrialization in particular. So this slide depicts some graphics that look at and comprise the world's population, the composition of the world's population. So I think many of us are used to being told that there's like two metaphorical worlds, that there's a developing world and a developed world. And Hans Rosling, who created these graphics and who's done a lot of really great research in this space, has said that that's an oversimplification, that actually things are a little bit more complicated than that. And he's reconceptualized, again, the composition of the world's population according to levels, which correspond to relative income and population size. And as you can see, the majority of the world's population, almost 75 to 80% of the world's population, almost 6 billion people, are currently residing on levels 2 and 3. These are what are known as middle income or emerging markets, and these places are of import as we kind of discuss the environmental implications here. Because just like what has happened with every industrialized nation on the planet, these places are undergoing rapid processes of industrialization whereby their social, political, and economic systems are transforming, in theory, in ways that will yield massive benefits to society at all levels, right? So they're mechanizing their economic structures, transforming their systems away from being agricultural led and towards being more mechanized based off of machinery. They're using a lot of the affluence gained to help build up infrastructure and increase access to resources for their country's people, which will allow for education rates to increase, healthcare to become of more quality and better distributed, and for society to develop according to the principles and the definitions that we've set forth, right, as a global community. All really amazing things. I think that everybody is advocating, of course, for people to be able to develop and to gain better access to resources and to transcend poverty and to, again, live better and more comfortable and healthier lives. But, from an environmental perspective, what is this going to mean? What is this going to mean that the majority of the world's population is moving into higher income brackets and going to demand more climate sensitive natural resources, going to have the money to demand more commodities like meat, which again are very environmentally intensive. What is all of this going to mean, these demographic shifts? And in no way am I saying that certain populations deserve to industrialize while others can't, or that there aren't enough resources to go around, or that everybody, we need to convince people that they don't actually want to consume more resources. No, like that's not the point. The point is to say, look at these demographic shifts and where they're occurring and how, and we need to be approaching this in ways that will allow us to adequately prepare. To me, this is yet another reason why we need to be changing the way that we're producing food and energy. We need to shift our production practices away from fossil fuels. We need to rely more heavily, if not exclusively, on renewable resources. We need to change our economic structures away from being consumption-led and away from being linear in structure and towards something that's a little bit more regenerative and circular. These are things that inevitably we need to be implementing. And I think that, you know, if we're looking at these demographic shifts, this is something that can hopefully like push things forward in a quicker way. So another one of the major connections between population and the environment is that of climate vulnerability. So as we were talking about before, the places that are growing the fastest are also the lowest income, and in a climate context, they're also the most vulnerable. So this means that the populations that are growing the fastest are the most climate vulnerable, the least able to prepare for, respond to, recover from mounting climate impacts. This is very clearly a climate justice issue as well, because these populations have not contributed hardly at all to the problem of climate change, but are experiencing the most severe effects. Also, from a climate justice perspective, it's important to understand that these places are growing the fastest because of institutionalized poverty, right? Places with very high fertility rates, you know, characteristically have really low levels of income, really high levels of patriarchal, oppressive sort of gender norms, and really low access to any type of modern contraception or sexual and reproductive health care, or other modalities that will help people, you know, access the resources necessary to control when, whether, and with whom to become pregnant. Right. So this is to say that these populations are growing quickly, not because people want to be having so many kids, but because they're sort of that's the condition under which they're living. So in terms of climate vulnerability, according to the UN, the world's 47 least developed countries are also the fastest growing, and many are projected to double in population between now and 2050. So this really increases strain on already scarce resources and slows progress in both health and economic growth. And as you can see, 9 out of the 10 most climate vulnerable countries are located in sub-Saharan Africa, which is growing very quickly, which is projected to double in population by 2050 alone. One example of this is the Sahel region of sub-Saharan Africa, which is actually an ecological region that encompasses these countries here depicted in the map on the green. And it represents a region that is probably experiencing one of the most pressing humanitarian crises, you know, facing the planet today. It's extremely vulnerable to climate change, and temperature increases here are happening 1.5 times faster than that of the global average, which is really threatening the availability of arable lands and water and the ability to produce food. And it's also got the highest population growth rates in the entire world. And it's also one of the lowest income places. So the confluence of these issues is creating a lot of havoc and a lot of instability. It is, you know, fueling even more unequal access to social and natural resources, perpetuating hunger, forcing migration and conflict, and further entrenching economic stagnation. As you can see, just because of how quickly everything is happening, especially the, you know, population growth, you know, something like food security or food insecurity is increasing and burgeoning kind of out of control in very short periods of time. So this, you can see just over the course of 1 year, things are getting much, much worse. And this is an issue that's continuing to compound out of control, and will continue to worsen unless things are done, which some attention is being paid to this region, but not much, not enough, right? And there are many different examples of, you know, climate vulnerability being impacted by population growth all around the world. I'd be happy to talk to you about some of these country level examples in the discussion if that's of interest to any of you. But the point is that especially in developing countries, population pressures really exacerbate the impacts of climate change and cause a lot of increased challenges, right, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the ability to adapt, in terms of the amount of people at risk, in terms of developments, economic stability, and so on. And so as we kind of switch gears here and get into the final aspects of this presentation, I want to be introducing solutions. So these include investments in sustainable developments like education, healthcare, and women's empowerment as modalities that will help build resilience and adaptive capacity. And within these solutions is a very direct need to increase access to comprehensive reproductive healthcare. So this is one very important solution to an adaptation strategy for climate change. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page, since we're switching gears a little bit here, voluntary family planning and reproductive healthcare are really, fundamental for development within any society. It's considered internationally a human right because most fundamentally it facilitates informed choice, which allows women and couples to freely and responsibly determine the number, timing, and spacing of their births. And it yields a lot of different health benefits. I think many of them are well known. Reduced rates, of course, of unintended pregnancies, increased overall health, reduced mortality. But also it yields myriad benefits in social, economic, and environmental terms, right? So voluntary family planning is super important for increasing education rates for women and girls. It improves livelihoods and well-being. It's, again, fundamental for reducing poverty. And from an environmental perspective, as we were kind of talking about before, it really relieves pressure on natural resources, on the economy, on food production, on infrastructure, and so on. And coupled very essentially with family planning is education. It's common to see the two grouped together whenever these solutions are being presented in a global context because they largely co-constitute one another, right? So in terms of family planning, if we're interested in increasing access worldwide, it's not enough just to increase access, right? We need to also confront many of the cultural and social norms that might otherwise prevent people from utilizing this resource. And that's where education comes into play. Of course, education is also considered internationally a human right because it's very clearly fundamental to being human. But, in terms of family planning uptake, it's very important to be educated, of course, about family planning, but also just in general, right? Because education yields independent and even critical thought, which again is very necessary in overcoming some of these barriers. From a more social perspective, whenever education levels rise for women and girls, they gain access to various forms of power in social, economic, and political spheres. Higher levels of education yield more options for sustained employment and help increase livelihoods. This frees up resources to help people and families choose when and how to start a family. So worldwide, no matter where you are or what the cultural affiliation may be, women who are educated tend statistically to have fewer, healthier children. And again, this is something that we can see play out very clearly throughout the world. This is even amidst very conservative, very religious cultures and countries. Really, the biggest indicator of whether or not children or women are going to have fewer children is level of education and access to contraceptives. And this is to say that family planning, of course, is a human right, and it's most fundamentally that, and it's worthy and valid, just, period, in that sphere. But it's also much more than that, right? It's also very central to women's empowerment, to reducing poverty, to building climate resilience, and to achieving sustainable development. And worldwide, this is really important because, as we were talking about before, there's a confluence of issues that are affecting the very same already very at-risk regions, right? So the very same places that experience high levels of climate vulnerability also have low levels of education and really high unmet needs for family planning. So, in these contexts, especially, increasing access to family planning and education could really help these regions and these populations adapt and respond and recover in ways that will, help and save many lives. And there's a lot of research substantiating this fact that meeting women's needs for family planning and reproductive health directly benefits climate adaptation. And the reasons for this are pretty straightforward, right? So obviously, whenever people gain access to healthcare, they become healthier. This is a fundamental aspect of building resilience. They also become more empowered, which enables better, engagement in climate adaptation efforts. Rates of unintended pregnancies drop, and slower population growth also ensues over the longer periods of time, which again is very important for lessening pressure on environmental systems. And finally, in terms of mitigation, or the capacity that meeting unmet needs for family planning and education have for actually reducing emissions over time, this is a really viable way forward as well and solution. I think that's really important for us to understand and start integrating, which is that just by meeting unmet needs worldwide, just by giving people access to resources they're already saying they want and that are human rights anyway, we could reduce emissions of up to almost 70 gigatons of CO2 equivalent by 2050 alone. This makes it the third most viable solution out of a list of 82 different solutions that were created by Project Drawdown, which is an organization I mentioned earlier, and one that I really recommend looking into if you're at all interested in this issue. They do ongoing research looking at assessing and then ranking different climate solutions based off of various indicators like upfront cost, return on investments, the capacity for profit, basically what it's going to take to implement the resource, and at what level it's going to yield returns. And again, healthcare and education is ranked third out of 82 different solutions. These solutions include, as you can see here, all of the things listed, but also things like solar power, wind power, all of the kind of characteristic climate solutions that we're all well aware of. So this to me is a really big deal and something that needs to, again, be more broadly understood and integrated. I think that this is an ancillary point, right? This is secondary to the fact that meeting unmet needs for healthcare and education are worthy just by themselves, and we should be working to address these gaps just because that's the right thing to do, and it's it means the expansion of human rights. But if we incorporate the environment as well, in my opinion, it seems to open up different possibilities for funding from different places and different organizations and different, funding streams. And this is really important because there's huge funding gaps that still exist, right? And there's a huge gap in access. So worldwide, like 257 million women want to avoid pregnancy, but are currently not using any modern form of contraception. And 218 million of these women live in LMICs, which are low to middle income countries or developing regions. This yields a lot of different negative health impacts, but in terms of population, also results in about 111 million unintended pregnancies annually. In contrast, if all needs were met, and if everybody was able to receive care at the levels recommended by the World Health Organization, the impacts would be enormous. There would be a 68% drop in unintended pregnancies, a 72% reduction in unsafe abortions, a 62% drop in maternal deaths, all really, really, important and impactful solutions, again, from all spheres, from the social, economic, and environmental perspectives. So that's kind of what we work on, is to help meet these unmet needs and to expand access all around the world to these resources. And right now, with all of the different contributions combined, there is still a $5.5 billion annual funding gap that exists for fully meeting these needs globally. For every dollar spent on family planning, $120 of returns are given right? So this is again a resource that's very worth investing into from all perspectives. The United States is consistently the biggest contributor of such aid, but it represents a really small fraction of our budgets, and it's constantly under threat. So we work to kind of streamline consistency through family planning funding internationally, because so many different organizations and countries depend on our support. And because it's become such a partisan issue, it really depends on who's in power, whether or not this resource is going to be funded and the extent to which it's going to be funded. So this creates a lot of precarity for organizations that, again, depend on our aid to survive and to provide care. So we work with different politicians and on different policies that cover this issue, with the intention of, again, expanding access to reproductive rights throughout the world. And yeah, so that's it. Thanks everyone so much for listening. I know we covered a lot of information today related to population health and the environment. Ultimately, we argued that rights-based solutions that are rooted in gender equality are very necessary, not only in terms of, propelling sustainable development forward, but also in terms of climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and resilience building. So we can open it up for questions now, but thanks very much. And here's my email if you're interested in getting in touch with me. I'd love to hear from you.
That's great. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. I'm looking for hands, or I don't see anything in the chat. Does anybody have a question? I have a few, but I'm going to try to take a back seat and let you guys have a chance. Questions or comments?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how the best way to word it.
Yeah.
A lot of my more conservative friends talk about how climate change is really not a problem. We're coming out of an ice age anyway. There was the big climate thing in the 70s that didn't turn out to be anything. What I don't know how to argue that. I'm not a scientist. I don't know how to refute that. Is there a way, or is it just that they're hopelessly lost, or are there data stuff to back them up? What would you recommend on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think at this point, it's like impossible to refute that climate change exists. We're seeing temperatures break records every single year. I mean, look at what's going on in Europe. Look at what's going on in the United States. The level of extreme weather events that are occurring all across the world, South Asia, and even the Gulf of Mexico, and the Bahamas, like in the Philippines, there's constantly like really extreme weather events that are changing things, that are creating a lot of havoc, that are breaking so many different records. I think it's very clear at this point. And if these people are continuing to make this argument, then they're not paying attention to what's going on ecologically speaking, or in terms of the environment, because it's like it's totally changing. I don't know if you guys are able to see the changes where you're living, but I certainly am. Even in where I'm living, in San Diego and also Hawaii, things are completely changing. We're starting to experience weather events that we've never had before. San Diego, in my opinion, is turning into San Francisco. We're seeing fog, we're seeing cold weather, we're seeing like rain, so just in that way, just experimentally, I think it's very, very clear. But tell them to just look at temperature increases and where records have been broken. I mean, tens of thousands of people are dying in Europe every single summer from heat waves, right? Yeah, there's just countless examples, I think. But the IPCC is a really good resource if you're interested at all in data. And again, they're saying, and again, this is an international organization that's not necessarily partisan at all. They're just a research agency. And I really do think that they're one of the most conservative assessments. And they were, for a long time, were reluctant to say that human influence was contributing to climate change, but now are saying, without a doubt, unequivocally, temperature increases are happening and occurring because of human influence. Let me see if I can show you this one. thing here.
While you're looking, I'll read you in the chat. Dave Taylor just said, people who claim humans do not contribute to climate change are buying the same kind of arguments that tobacco companies used to cast doubt on the links of smoking to cancer. Not a question, it's just a comment. So I figured I'd throw that in there while you were typing.
Yeah, there's a great documentary called Merchants of Doubt where it discusses that same thing. That it looks into kind of the corporate or political influence behind sowing doubt into climate change. Basically, people purposely going in and creating what seems like scientific documents, kind of refuting all of the scientific evidence with the mere intention of creating doubt in people, making them think, oh, well, maybe it is just solar flares, or maybe it is this or that. Whenever the science has always been clear, the science has always been very unequivocal. Let me see here if I can just, so I wanted to just show you guys this one thing. Oh no. Sorry. Oh, here. So you can see that during the Industrial Revolution, again, which is kind of where all of this started, this is like the point at which climate change kind of became a thing. Like the very same point in time when population growth began to kind of explode was the same point in time when global CO2 emissions from fossil fuels and land use change began to increase kind of out of control, which is the same point in time when the average temperature anomalies for the Earth have increased. So this is very much to do with our social, political, and economic systems, very much to do with the shifts that took place during the Industrial Revolution, and very much being perpetuated by humans. Mm-hmm.
Al, I see that your hand is up. Let's let you ask your question, and then I'll circle back and grab David's out of the chat.
Yes, Hannah, thank you so much for such a comprehensive presentation, very scary as well. The question I have is, based on your observations, are we making much progress in terms of addressing these very complex issues, especially when you get to cultural, religious, and all of the other aspects that tend to get in the way in some ways of primarily population growth and development?
Well, that's a good question. I think that we're making progress, and we're simultaneously not moving fast enough, and we're simultaneously regressing, right? So at the same point that things are better than they ever have been in history, we're still experiencing massive assaults on reproductive rights and access to care domestically and internationally. We're having to contend with climate change and the fact that our global leaders are not really working very hard to address the issue and are continuing our reliance on fossil fuels. In terms of population growth, we know that the best way to slow population growth into the future is to just give people access to resources and to achieve gender equality. And that is happening in many places throughout the world, but in the most affected regions, it's still, a kind of a far reach. So I want to have these conversations, and I give these presentations with the intention of trying to infuse hope, believe it or not, even though a lot of this information is quite scary. But I think we're talking about things at a global scale and from a bird's eye perspective, which can kind of obfuscate the truth sometimes and makes it look like things are much worse than they need to be. And I think the purpose of this for me is to recognize that instead of blaming each other for what's going on and all of the problems that we're facing, we need to look at the broader system under which we're all operating, which is contributing to our behaviors and our inefficiencies and the imbalances that we're seeing play out socially, environmentally, politically. and from there to work to confront that from a more localized perspective. Like I don't want us to be blaming each other or to be thinking that it's our fault necessarily, even though of course we're all contributing to this. But I think the point is rather to find ways to come together and find ways to refute these systems with our everyday actions and with our conversations with people and with our broader awareness and our expanded consciousness around these issues and how we want to confront them in our own ways through our consumption patterns, through the conversations we're having, through everything. That makes sense.
Yeah. I think I can wrap a little bit of what I wanted to say around what David Robinson said in the chat. So going back to like messaging and partisanship, he writes in the chat, how can this information, which is very good, do anything to help our future if our political leaders are dominated by the values of patriarchal religion? That's the elephant in the room. And I was thinking along those same lines, like on the one hand, I think it is hopeful because I know when they do polling young people who are the future, right, who are going to continue to vote in greater numbers, climate change is like their number one concern. So when you're pairing the women's reproductive rights and the education with the climate change, and if we can get the message out that it's all related, that's only going to help, I would think, things going forward. Once these people become older, they're voting, they're becoming our new set of leaders with that set of interests. And then I love that you're thinking of this in a way of like how you could have new streams of funding, because to me, $5.5 billion is all we lack to get people the contraception that they want. It's nothing. That's nothing. $5.5 billion is nothing. Think of what just our country alone spends on defense.
Yeah.
And you saw in your numbers the boon that's going to make, right? The surplus of funding you're going to have when people get anyway. So that was a lot to say. And I guess maybe really the question is, going back to Dave, we're in an unfortunate position right now where we do have, in the United States at least, leaders that tend to fight on reproductive health care and are in kind of denial. I mean, is it just a waiting game? Are we just waiting for the youth to rise up and force this change? Or is there, some way we can speed this along, I guess, with messaging or?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think it's something that we're constantly having to contend with and confront. And I don't unfortunately know the answer. I mean, I would love to be able to take a lot of faith in our elected leaders and in our political system, but in my experience so far, that has not really proven to be very effective, just because, again, the system itself just seems so entangled and corrupted. And that's not to say that it's not a valid system as well, and that there aren't benefits and positive things about it. But I think one thing that I've learned through this work, and as I've started to get older, is to recognize our political structures for what they are. And again, that's not to say that there isn't a lot of great things about them, but to pay less attention to what's going on at these structural levels and more attention to what it is that I, as an individual, want to do to make the world a better place. How can I contribute to a brighter world? What does a brighter world mean to me? Like, if we think about making the world a better place, are we clear on what that actually means to each of us? What would a day look like if we weren't existing in this like mindless consumerist society? Who are we outside of consumerism? So this kind of gets a little bit more to the inner work aspect, the evolutionary aspect of these transformations that we want to see. And I really believe that they happen more on an individual level rather than at the political level. They happen on the political level too. And of course, it's very important for us to be paying attention to what's going on politically and to vote and to, believe that things can be better. But I think that also attention is paid, is so much attention is paid to these systems that are pretty much almost designed to fail. Like, the same problems keep coming up, the same problems don't get solved, the same issues are recurring over and over and over again. And Democrats, Republicans, our whole structure is so messed up, unfortunately. And I'm being very frank with you guys. But I think it's also, that's just an opportunity for us to, instead of look at and kind of assign ideologies to ourselves and to other people and subscribe to them, we can instead say, look, this is happening over there and it's valid and it's interesting, but this is not the answer. This is not where the problems are going to be solved. How can we actually transform things? And to me, that comes from inner expansion and the work that we do on ourselves to become better people. I'm often asked, like, what's the best way forward? What's the most effective thing that we can do to make the biggest difference? And I think that we're at this period of time where everything is so dire and things are changing and things are evolving and there's massive disruption. It's all connected, so instead of looking at and saying, like, what's the best way environmentally forward, what's the biggest impact that I can make, it's more about connecting with yourself of what am I actually passionate about? What is the impact that I want to make on this planet? And what do I want to contribute? And from there, throw yourself into whatever it is you're passionate about. I think that's going to make the biggest difference.
Yeah. And, I do hear there were some really scary numbers in your presentation, but I did overall feel like it was hopeful. Like, I just keep going back to that 5.5 billion. Now I'm a little bit obsessed. And then Dave Taylor just threw something in the chat. Compare what we spend on smoking to what's needed for that 5.5. In 2023, the revenue in tobacco products market in the US alone was $106.4 billion. We only need 5.5. That's like one Bill Gates, or maybe three maybe Bill Gateses, to take an interest in this issue and put that money up annually, and people have the contraception they need. And then based on your numbers, look at the domino effect that would have on everything: climate change, education, overpopulation. It's like you said, it's all related. And that alone, that one small number, I just am fixated on it personally right now. Like, oh my gosh, we can do this.
Yeah. And the point is to recognize that the same systems that have oppressed people are causing all of this disruption in the environment, right? It's all connected. So, solving environmental problems, again, means solving social and political and economic problems as well.
Yeah. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? We've kept her a little past. We had an hour and it's been, I think, an hour and 20 minutes. So we don't want to be disrespectful of your time, because obviously you're doing very important work. We're so glad you're here sharing this research with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. And then we are recording this and it's going to go up on our website and we'll stay there. Usually we have a few more people than this. It's just super busy. Homecoming is tomorrow. It's not your fault. It's just what it is. Fall is crazy. Good. I'm sure maybe everywhere, but certainly here in the Midwest, fall, every nice weekend, there's just a zillion things going on. Yeah. Dave Robinson says, yeah, that 5.5 billion is great. Oh, see Al Plummer's comment. Oh, Al says, I believe the human animal is exceptionally creative. It's too bad much of our creativity is focused on destruction. If that could only be turned around, I can only imagine the impact it would have on positive change. Yeah.
And I think that's the direction we're ultimately going. I believe that.
Yeah.
It'll probably take us a while to get there.
A generation or two, maybe, unfortunately.
At least.
Yeah. But I think we are headed the right direction, as long as the young people now don't get jaded, right? As long as their interests that they have now are still their interests when they're still voting, when they're 30 and 40, I think we're headed the right way. And it's just mystifying to me how so much of this has been made a partisan issue, when you're right, education is a human rights issue. Like, it's amazing to me that how did that become a democratic issue? Why is that not just an issue? Like hunger or something. How did that get politicized? I know how, but it's a shame that it has gotten politicized in that way, and then made it harder to raise money for things like contraception. Again, for people who are wanting it, we would never obviously force sterilization on someone. People are wanting it. And I loved how your presentation was careful in your language about that. It's people who are wanting this help. They are wanting access to this kind of reproductive health care and not getting it. And how much that would benefit the entire planet if they could just have what they need. Yeah.
I think there are many groups that are working on getting more people registered to vote. The League of Women Voters is currently working on getting young women registered to vote. And I think that's very important as to what is happening in Missouri, because there is an initiative petition that hopefully will get on the ballot sometime soon. It's in the courts about reproductive health.
And rights to abortion and getting that in the
Mhm.
Constitution. Because yeah, I don't know, you probably don't have to follow Missouri that much, but we're pretty much the breeding ground and the testing case for every horrible thing you can think of. It used to be Kansas, and now they've got a great governor, and now it's us. Like,
It does make a big difference.
if they're going to try to do something horrible to women, they're going to try it in Missouri first, it seems like.
Mhm.
Oh
Yeah.
no.
Yeah. So,
Well,
so
glad
we're
there's
very, very
groups like you
appreciative of your
guys.
work. Yeah, we're very
Yeah.
appreciative of your work and very glad to hear that. See what our little piece of it. We see kind of a negative piece of it, but globally, I think there is a more of a hopeful story. And
Yeah.
we can do this, right?
We have to
can do
maintain
this.
hope.
Yeah, we can do
Have
this.
Mhm.
Dave Taylor says we used to be the bellwether state. Now we're the hell weather state. And David Robinson said we're doing horrible stuff to education too. Yeah, it's all of a piece here
Yeah.
in Missouri. Good old Missouri.
Handbooks, transgender health, you name it.
All right. Well, if nobody else has any, I know, I mean, I have 1,000 questions. We could keep her here for the next week, and I don't think I'd run out of things to talk about. This has been so great. And I'm actually going to go and watch this again because I just didn't even have time to digest all those great graphics. I'm so glad we're recording this so I can go back and like really, look at those maps. I love data, and this was so well researched. Thank you so much for being
Yes.
here. Just one last round of applause.
Thank you
Yes.
so much for
Wonderful.
having me.
Yeah,
It's really,
yeah, thank you.
it gives me so much hope to know that you guys exist and you guys are meeting and talking about things and working to find solutions. I mean, I think that this is what we need. This is
Hannah Evans, if you have a link to your PowerPoint presentation, or if it's posted on a website somewhere, let us know so I can post that as well.
Sure, I can give you a link to our resources page, which
Oh, that'd be
has-
amazing.
Perfect.
Yeah, this is a page where I develop resources as well, including PowerPoint presentations, info briefs, and so on, that you can freely
Yeah,
download.
I think we've got a drink or something in there at the table.
Milkshake. I can't finish it.
Here.
I never saw you get up. I was afraid you hadn't had them. Okay. This is great. I'm giving you a chance to do it. You're going to throw it in the chat, yeah?
Yes,
There it goes. There it goes.
there you go.
Oh, yeah. Population connection, back resources. That's easy. Okay, great. Well, this has just been wonderful. I mean, a lot of times we get really, really local and granular, and we're having like a city council person on here. So this is a little bit unusual. I'd say maybe 10% of our presentations are like this global, but man, this has been a barn burner. I love it.
Yeah.
Great,
And now
so
you've got this. Yeah, and now you've got this many people who kind of understand how this is all interconnected, and we're going to carry this information forward in all the work we do and be able to
amazing.
relay our layman's understanding of what you just said.
And we had a
all this
Missourian
connected.
journalist, so
Yeah.
there may lead to an article in the newspaper as well.
Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
Wouldn't
We
be
have
surprised if Haley
two
Sullivan-
newspapers in Columbia
Yeah.
because of our J school.
All right.
Wonderful.
Well, if nobody else has anything else, I think we're going to go ahead and conclude this meeting and log off for the week. But this has been so great, and I'll look forward to seeing a lot of you at the homecoming parade in the morning, and then again at our Zoom meeting next Friday at noon. Thank you
Okay.
very much for being here.
Thanks, everyone. Have a
Yeah.
great
Thank you so much,
Have a
Hannah.
great week. Yeah.